Okay, so we have a real mix, and hopefully after this you will feel a lot more confident. So let's get started, and let's start by talking about your introduction. So your introduction is absolutely essential in providing the reader with key information about your dissertation's aims, argument and structure. It's really important to keep your reader in mind at all times throughout the dissertation, but especially in your introduction, as this can help to ensure that you set out your aims, your argument, and the evidence you're going to use to support it as clearly as possible. So think about how you might explain your dissertation to a friend or family member, as this will help you to focus on being really clear and precise. So it needs to be that level where you're just really clearly putting out your aims, what you're going to look at and why. It also, thinking about how you'd explain it to a family member, also ensures that you are really clear on what your core purpose, aims and argument and the structure of work is going to be. So let's start by going over some important aspects of an introduction. It's important to recognise at this stage that there are a range of dissertation types and different disciplines have different conventions. So you will need to reflect on what parts are important to your dissertation. However, this list here, which we'll go through point by point, shows some of the key components of introductions. Let's start with the first one. So you should open your introduction by directly addressing the subject of your dissertation. So don't go off on a tangent talking about really kind of broad statements about your subject. Directly refer to what you're going to be addressing in your dissertation. But then you need to take a step back and just provide the reader with a brief description of the background, context and setting in which the study has taken place. So just open your introduction by addressing exactly what you're going to be looking at and then place it within its historical, cultural and critical context. So this will help situate your research within the context of what was happening at that time. So you might want to mention what was happening historically at that point, what are the current critical debates on the subject so far, and so on. So where does it sit, what you're looking at, your topic, where does it sit within the historical period you're looking at or within the academic discussion? So that's how you should think about starting it off. It can be useful then to define or clarify your use of central terms from your dissertation title from the outset, so that the reader is clear on your use and understanding of core terms. So if there is like some words that are really central, some terms, some ideas or concepts which are at the center of your dissertation, and that's the foundation of it, it can be a really good idea to define or clarify how you'll be using those terms from your introduction. However, if for some topics it may be best to define and discuss key terms in the opening chapter or literature review instead, especially if you need a bit more space, you need to go into more detail because they're contentious or there's multiple interpretations. Okay, before we move on, I just say again to anyone who joined us late, welcome to this webinar on dissertation writing. I'm Elizabeth and there's Erin and Martina who are helping in the chat box as well. We are just going through some of the key parts of an introduction. Okay, the next thing it's important to do, and this is really core, is you need to, in your introduction, really clearly state your research aims and the research questions you're seeking to address. So what do you want to find out? This involves explaining what your research aims to achieve and what core intellectual problems you are seeking to address. For example, if your dissertation title was Alternative Perspectives on the Wall Street Crash, some of the key research questions you may want to address could include: how did the Wall Street crash affect American women? Did the impact of the Wall Street crash extend to rural America? Was the Wall Street crash connected to the rise of anti-immigrant feeling in America? So it's thinking about what are the core intellectual questions that your dissertation is going to engage with and attempt to answer. So in the chat box, I would like you to have a think, and can you share some of the key research questions from your dissertation that you are going to aim to address? And I'll give you a few minutes to do this, but please share them in the chat box so that we can get an idea of some examples of these type of research questions. These are really excellent. Keep going, and I'll read through a few, but these are great. Just whilst you're writing, and we picked up that someone was asking whether to write your introduction last, I think. And some people do, because your introduction, you've got to know what you're looking at, what theoretical aspects you're going to include. You've got to have a really clear idea of what you're going to be doing. And sometimes that takes a lot of research and writing. So some people do write it last, but I would have thought you need to kind of be developing these ideas anyway. So I'd be at least making notes throughout on what your introduction is going to say. But yeah, by the end, once you've finished all the research and writing, you should be able to firm it up. Keep writing, these are great. So these are great. Let's have a look through. So we just have I'll randomly pick out a few. To what extent does the media affect public opinion on political matters? Yes, that's a really interesting question. What's a teaching assistant's role? That's nice in supporting SEN. Has Meghan Markle been treated fairly? Excellent. Oh, and then, yeah, you should have more than one. And this definitely, was she treated in a similar way to Diana? Excellent. So Fatima, of tourism and food, that's a subject you're going to look at. And then you think, well, what exactly do you want to know? Like, to what extent does tourism influence food production, for example? But just having what you want to know about that subject. Great, Christina. Excellent. Tanya, nice, excellent, very detailed. And Carmela, nice. These are all really good. So Georgie, anxiety and depression and the impact on attentional control, focusing and shifting. Good. And to shift that into an actual research question, because that's your subject, you could say, to what extent does, or something, and that's what you want to find out. These are really excellent. I love the range of subjects. How my ideas of values and Englishness appear in costumes and sets of the period. Great. These are all great. They're really fantastic. So it is about doing that. And then having these research questions can actually really help shape your whole structure, because you'll be thinking, okay, in order to answer these questions, how do I structure my dissertation to make sure I'm kind of really covering all these main things? Excellent. So any questions at this point? You can write them in the chat box, but they seem really good. So first thing to think about is thinking about your research questions. What do you want to find out about? Another thing you need to do is think about give an overview in your introduction of your research method. So you've got the questions that you're going to be looking at, how are you going to answer them? So you're thinking about what's the most suitable approach for your project. So in other words, explaining how you will go about finding the answer to your research question, and then saying why this is the best approach. So this information on research methods or methodology, if you're using a particular approach, in your introduction, it will probably be quite brief, as you'll go into it in more detail probably in the main body of your dissertation. So for example, you may briefly note in your introduction that be using a specific theoretical model or some kind of particular scholarly approach, but you provide more detail about this in the main body. But it's just nice to, following on from this is what I want to find out, just briefly say this is how I'm going to approach finding out about it. Great. Another important point to include in your introduction is the significance of your research, or in other words, your rationale for choosing the subject for your dissertation. This means that you need to reflect on why your subject is important and worth exploring. So why are you doing this? You've got to think about, why are you looking at this subject? And you need to think about what importance or significance means in particular for what you're looking at. So there could be either academic reasons, personal reasons, or cultural reasons for doing it. For example, you may be using a new approach to a subject or addressing an under-examined subject. So you might say, my research is important because there's been an absence of meaningful research in this area. Or for some subjects, like I know the therapies, and some subjects will allow a more personal reason for why you want to do it. Or it might be culturally or socially, it's an important issue. So what I'd like you to do now is just reflecting on your dissertation, your subject. Can you share the rationale for doing it? Why are you looking at it? Why is it an important subject to study? And share that in the box. Okay, these are really good actually. So let's talk through. Let me scroll back up to, I think, so to explore more treatment options for cystic fibrosis. So, that obviously just has a really strong rationale to look at that. to understand the life of street vendors in Spain after arriving as refugees. As well, that has an excellent academic, but also a social rationale for doing it. Good. I like yours, Caitlin, about the accountability. So you're talking about, and that has real contemporary relevance to things that have happened recently, how people have spoken about in the media. Ross, you've kind of brought to the forefront, you talked about socially. So you've got a social one. Fatima, with yours, you say, my research is about poor appetite in people. Maybe that is. That obviously has a really important kind of real life impact on people. So it's just rewording it to make it clear. So the rationale of my research is to kind of help, or, to identify a lack of research on this area. Good. And Kapari as well, you're exploring children's culture and identity, but it's this kind of why is that important to do? So Tamin, to better understand. So that's an academic thing, but it's also actually because it has a real world application. Good. And again, with the franchises, that has real world application to help businesses. Good. And Radka as well, just very, very contemporary, very important. Good. Yep, research. So Jen, when you've seen that, had never been any research to look at that. I think that's really good. So that's the argument that academically it's under-examined. Although I would say with that, be careful of language sometimes. So it's good to say things like this. My dissertation addresses a gap in knowledge rather than fills, or whether there's never been. Be careful of that unless you're absolutely sure there's not been any, because you can just put things like it's extremely limited or something like that, just to protect yourself in case you've missed anything. The personal one, Jade, is good. Good. Environmental, obviously, very clear. Same with yours, Layla. Zaran, just a really clear reason. These are great. And Gratia, that's really nice, detailed, saying why it's important. Excellent. And then things like yours, Saul, to identify cosmopolitanism in different media texts. That's like more of an academic reason, and that's fine. Excellent. And just having a look through them. And then Layla, you've looked for specifically for a particular group of people it's useful. Excellent. So I think that's really nice to put in your introduction, saying why it's important, especially because academic writing tends to be quite objective and formal. It's nice to kind of show your passion for and show your importance for the subject just by putting it in, framing it in an academic way, but saying this is important, this is worth looking at. Excellent. Keep typing things in the box if you would like to, but we'll continue. So if you talked about why it's worth doing, the next thing, which we're going to come back to, but one of the key parts of most dissertation is a strong argument. And you should state this argument, or another word for it is thesis statement, from the outset in your introduction. So the thing with a dissertation, you kind of give it in whole. So it's not like it reflects your process of thinking. It's like, after doing all of the thinking and research, this is what I'm presenting. So you don't have to get to the conclusion and say, ta-da, this is what I think. From the introduction, you can say, this is my argument. And that will help you to be far more critical. But we're going to come back to this in a few slides' time. It's also, in your introduction, really important to provide an outline structure for the dissertation, or a chapter breakdown, signposting what topics you'll be covering in each chapter in order to answer your research question and support your argument. So to help the reader out, so you've set out, I'm looking at this subject, this is what approach I'm going to use to look at it, this is why it's worth doing, this is where I stand on it, and then you say, in order to support this argument, chapter 1 does this, chapter 2 does this, and chapter 3 does this. So just give us an overview of what you're going to do in each section. For some dissertation subjects, you may also want to set some parameters for your analysis and justify them in your introduction. Does anyone know what I mean by parameters? Yes, yeah, Tanya and yeah, Caitlin. Yeah, so parameters are just like your focus or your boundaries. So a lot of the time when we see people at drop-in, sometimes they'll show us these kind of dissertation subjects and they're really broad. And then there's a risk of tripping yourself up because if you don't focus in on specific areas, then you're spreading yourself too thinly in terms of what you're looking at. So it's good to put some parameters. So parameters just mean the boundaries of your research or its focus. For example, if I was studying the use of propaganda in the Second World War, I may have a geographical parameter, such as just looking at UK or just looking at German propaganda. So I have a geographical parameter. Or I might have a temporal or time-centered parameter, such as focusing on the final year of the war rather than the whole thing. Or I might look at a certain genre or medium. So, for example, I might look at propaganda films or propaganda in mainstream media. So with your subject, can you just share any parameters of your subject, of your research? So, for example, you might be looking specifically at one country in Africa, or you might be looking at 1960 to 65, or you may be using a feminist approach specifically. So can you share your parameters in the chat box? Keep writing, everyone. I'm just going to answer a few things. Gratia, with the putting what you're going to cover, yeah, your table of content, if you're asked to do one, yes, you could put your chapter, what you're going to look like, and the subsections in each one. But also in your introduction, just in a more prose form, you'd want to just give a kind of an overview. Okay, great. These parameters are good. Keep looking. I'll just have a look through and look at any issues. Yeah, Caitlin. So if you're just focusing on the Daily Mail, yep. You maybe would want to be careful that isn't too narrow, but yeah, that would be a parameter focusing on it. Yeah, Husner with just secondary school, that's definitely putting a parameter on. Great, yeah, Gratia, that's really English, medieval society in Godalming. Yeah, that's great. That's real parameters. Good. Yeah, Ikram, that's your controls. Yes. Yeah, with Radka, you might want to, it depends if you find research. I mean, that might be broad enough because that might be fine because you want to look kind of globally, or you might want to look at UK and just see what UK universities do to support them. Caitlin, yeah, I think your parameters are, yeah, if you're just looking at Daily Mail representations, and that's one thing, that would be a parameter. The timeline, I suppose, is you might not need to specify so much because she's only been in the media in a recently, unless you want to look at a specific one. Yeah, dating preference, women only, good. Excellent. Yes, so we got lots of geographical on the UK and different communities. Yeah, it might be a physical setting. So we're looking at one secondary school, teaching assistants in one setting. Yeah, England, 1931. We got all of the parameters in there. We got geographical, temporal, and then also particular type of dance, ballet. Excellent. Great. Let me have a look at this research for how can current educational policy and practice and layout, paediatric, good. Primary school children. Yeah, with the primary, you might want to focus on a particular in UK, how UK deals with it, for example, or something like this. Good. Spain, Madrid, Barcelona. Yeah. Yeah. So Fatima, just by what I meant was the parameters, you might not need them. Don't force them. If within your title, for example, you've already kind of been clear about what you're looking at, that's fine. But just if it's only if it's necessary, you just say, if your subject's quite broad, what particular aspect of it you are going to look at. So I was talking to someone at Drop In today, and they were looking at crowdfunding, and they said they'd focus on how it's done in Facebook and LinkedIn. So 2 social media platforms rather than loads. So they've just specified that's what they're going to look at. So it's just any specific boundaries of your research. Excellent. That's really good. Well done. And they seem really good, really interesting topics as well. Let's carry on. So I want to go back to one of the key aspects of most dissertations, and that's a strong central argument or thesis statement. So for some subjects, you may not reach your final arguments until the discussion chapter following your analysis of results. And that's fine. Although you may have a hypothesis, so you might have an idea of what you think is going to happen, and you would put that in the introduction. However, most humanities dissertations require you to state your argument clearly from the outset as part of the introduction. Having a strong core argument or thesis statement is central to setting out a clear stance on the subject that allows you to have a strong academic voice within the wider critical debate. So this stops you from just describing, because when you're bringing in evidence or discussing someone's theory, you're not just saying this is what they say, you're testing everything against your central argument. So this thesis statement is the connecting narrative that connects all parts of the dissertation. So it's the one through line, and it's integral to how you structure your extended piece of writing. So it's really essential to go beyond just having a general subject you're looking at or area you want to study, and instead to develop a clear stance or a position on it. So, for example, if your general subject area you wanted to look at, you were kind of interested in the Cold War, feminist revisionist history, you may then refine this to consider the research question, what was the impact of the Cold War on women in Russia? The next step would be to have a position on this. So, for example, for the majority of women in Russia, the Cold War was extremely detrimental. So you've gone beyond just saying, I'm going to look at this subject, to having an argument and a position on it. You can see it again from this example, the second example. So if your general subject area was military recruitment in the First World War, and you refine that to a more specific research question, which was, what extent were traditional ideas of masculinity used in Britain, notice the parameters here, to encourage military recruitment in the First World War, then your argument in response to your research question could be this: traditional ideas of masculinity were central to political and social pressures to enlist. So there you've just gone beyond saying, this is what I'm going to look at, to having a stance that you think gender was really important to pressure to enlist. So this is a really important aspect of your dissertation, and quite central. So what I'd like you to do, and this it can only be a draft if you want, that's fine, but I just want you to think about, in a sentence or two, what is the core argument you want to make? Or if you're coming more from the sciences, it might be more, what is the hypothesis, or what do you think you are the results you are going to get? So could you please in the chat box share what is your main argument you are going to make in your dissertation? Okay, I'm just going to read through a few of these things, but just to say, if you're in the humanities, then if you're struggling with this or any discipline really, it's a really good thing to go and speak to your tutor about. But just to say, I'm going to try and find it, but there was something about linguistics, and that wasn't really putting forward an argument. For you, then, what it could be with in terms of that is that the argument comes out more in the final discussion, where you get to be critical by saying what this reveals. So that would be your argument after analyzing the discourse. Your argument is maybe what this reveals, or why this is important, or what this shows. That would be your argument. I'm just going to have a read through these. Keep going if you are going. Caitlin, yes, your thesis statement, Meghan Markle was negatively represented. And it's that kind of just really nice, clear sentence. And you would put that in your introduction, and then your main body is going through the actual nuance and the detail and how and why this was. Jam, in conversation, people talk in conversation. Yeah, so if you're looking at it, so your argument won't be so much maybe this main thesis statement, although you might come in with a hypothesis of what you expect or what you'll be looking at. But I think your argument will be more towards the end of what this reveals, the kind of so what clause. So this shows this. What have you learnt from it? General Elena, so that's your subject, but we want to know, what do you think about it? So migration and treatment in host country, very kind of like simplistically. So migrants are treated very poorly in the majority of host country would be more an argument. So going beyond just what you're looking at to what your stance is. Good. Yes, with the environmental one on Wales, yes, that you're saying that you're arguing that there could be an impact. Caitlin, yes. Ross, this is nice because this is nuanced. Whilst museums were useful to dominant cultures, they were harmful to most other populations. Excellent. So with that you had, and that's nice because it's what we call hedged. It's nuanced, that you say, although I recognise this, overall this. Good, Zarin, that's nice. Is not responsible. Good. new technology, so it can effectively. Good. So you're coming with that Poveda, you're like coming down, you have a stance. It can effectively. Patient, oops. Patient bacteria will have. Good. So Georgie, that's your subject in a test, control, shifting and focusing. But hopefully if you do research, you'll find out, does it have an effect? Anxiety and depression, what's the impact there? Good. Christina, yet we recycle more. If you're exploring a phenomena, Shiraz, I think with that then, rather than an argument, you'll have your research questions will be more important in the introduction. I'm going to be looking at this. But by the end, by your discussion, you should be able to, your argument will kind of be your main points that you're going to be making about that. Okay, I'm just having a quick look through these. Tourism could be, that language is good as well, Fatima. It could be a suitable treatment. Yep. You could even say is very likely, is likely to be. Good. So Zara, with yours, you've said your main argument is whether obesity, eating patterns and fiber intake of women affects them having polycystic ovarian syndrome or not. That's what you're looking at. But by the end of that, hopefully you'll be able to say to what degree you think it does or not. So you'll have a stance on it. Great. I'm just having a look through these. Yeah, Tanya, nice and detailed. Yeah, Radko, excellent. Hypothesis, we should be able to see. So let me look at yours. Gratia, I'm looking at the ones that they all seem really good. I'm just looking at the ones that have more questions with them. We should be able to see evidence of physical struggle associated with. Yeah, so I think that's good, your hypothesis. And then your argument will probably come from your results. So from your results, do we, can we see that? So that will be in your discussion things like what do they suggest? Excellent. Okay, so let's keep going because and we'll move on. But just be thinking about that, just having your voice and your argument coming through, or if it's not till the end, you're doing a research. Why is what you're finding significant? What have you found out? That might be how you think about it for others. Excellent. So having a strong argument is really central to your dissertation, or having clear aims or research questions, because they're the through line that can build cohesion and fluency throughout your dissertation. So this is the kind of how to build, how to connect up the different sections. A good introduction sets out your aims, argument, and how you will follow up your research. From this point, each chapter should develop that argument by engaging with evidence and analysing relevant aspects of the subject. Your conclusion then provides an overview of the aims stated in your introduction, summarising how you address them in the main body, and ending by providing a final kind of nuanced response. So you need this through line of like, these are my aims, all the way through, just reminding the reader of them. So if you're opening each chapter, you should open it with a few sentences, each chapter, which does this. First of all, you put the purpose and aim of the chapter. So why are you writing that chapter? What is it going to do? Then you want to relate that to your argument or thesis statement. Or if that's not going to come till later, then it's more about relate it to your overall, your broader research aims. And then you need to go into how it relates to the previous chapter, if relevant. So obviously for the first chapter, you don't need to say how it connected to the last. And then, because this is like a mini introduction, really, you give an overview of the topics you will cover in the chapter, really briefly. So let me just show you an example for that. Here's an example of those elements in an opening paragraph for a chapter. So it opens with an overview of what the previous chapter did. So it says, the previous chapter provided details of the cultural context of Britain in the 1930s. So then what it did, it then provides a link to this chapter whilst clearly stating what this chapter examines. This chapter aims to extend understanding of the period by considering the political context of the period. It then puts forward the central argument the chapter will make. In doing so, it argues that the cultural growth of the right-wing rhetoric was also present in political discourse. You can then see that it provides an overview of the key content of the chapter. So just briefly what it will cover. So it says, to support this argument, this chapter considers the language of political debate, analyses political rhetoric of three central political figures, and examines the influence of the British Union of Fascists on mainstream political discourse. It then finishes by connecting the chapter to the wider thesis statement. So this supports a broader argument that right-wing ideologies had a clear but under-examined presence across Britain in the 1930s. So it just says what it's going to do, how this connects to the broader aims of the thesis or the dissertation, and then and just kind of a breakdown of what it's going to cover. Then, because you want to really kind of top and tail, you can build cohesion and fluency by, at the end of each chapter, providing a brief overview of the main findings of each you've made in the chapter, linking this to your broader thesis statement or aims, and explaining why these findings are important. So, and then you can then link to the following chapter if you would like. So this is an example of a paragraph at the end of a chapter. So you can start with an overview of the main findings of the chapter. This chapter has argued that traditional ideas of masculinity were central to wartime propaganda by analysing a range of recruitment materials and considering theoretical perspectives on masculinity from Natasha Khan and Geoffrey Harris. It then states why what you did in that chapter is important. This is important as it foregrounds the role of gender in warfare and supports the argument that traditional ideas of masculinity were central to recruitment in the First World War. Then it ends by saying how the next chapter will further develop this discussion. The following chapter will examine German propaganda videos and recruitment materials in order to examine similarities in gender representation and norms. So by topping and tailing each chapter like this, you make a strong connection throughout and keep the focus on the main argument that you stated in your introduction. So when you're talking, let me have a look at a few of your questions. Caitlin, with the thesis statement, just make sure the language is hedged. So you can say, although there are these positives, overall this is a bad thing. And then your main body, it's not bias, it's an academic argument. But it is bias in that you have like a stance. You're not neutral, you put forward an argument. Fatima, literature reviews are different things altogether, and there are materials on that in the literature review, or you can come to the Learning Skills Hub. Sanders, I mean, chapter, most dissertations will be separated into distinctive chapters or sections. So just when you've got a main section, you start on that by just saying what you're going to do. Yeah, Jay, thank you. Chapter 1, literature review. Chapter 2, methodology. Yeah, thank you, Jay. That's really helpful. Is it good to name what's I'll come back to that. Great. Okay, so you've got, this is about all building fluency across. So your introduction puts your main aims, top and tail each chapter with why what you've talked about is related and important. Then your conclusion is really important, ensuring you have a really strong and consistent finish to it. Here are some tips just on writing your conclusion. The first stylistic thing you can do is to change to the past tense. So in your introduction, you would write, this dissertation will, whereas in the introduction, you shift to, this dissertation has. It can be useful to refer back to the dissertation title in the opening lines of your conclusion, just to bring it back to where it started and remind the reader of the central subject that you've been addressing. So nice to open your conclusion, kind of bringing it back to what is the thing you've been looking at. Your conclusion can be a good point to reflect again on why it's an important topic, because it might have been how many thousands of words since you did it in your introduction. So just again reiterating why this has been an important thing to look at. And then as you bring together your research and move towards a final conclusion, it can be really helpful to provide the reader of an overview of the key issues you've covered before finishing by providing, and this is a key thing, your final nuanced response to your research questions and why this matters, ensuring that this matches up with your thesis statement from your introduction. So some things I'd say about the introduction and conclusion, they're sometimes quite similar. Your introduction says, I'm going to do this and this will be my argument. Your conclusion says, I have done this and this is my final assessment. I would try and keep your introduction and conclusion mostly to just your voice. Don't bring in any new information or anything like that. You're just giving us an overview after doing all this research. This is your final say on it. So that is a lot of information, and you have a look back through them. But just thinking about now we've discussed some of those main elements, could you let me know, out of a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being very unconfident and 5 being very confident, has your confidence improved? Do you feel a bit more confident about it, 1 to 5? I love that confidence, 7. I think these are good. Great, keep going with these. It's a lot of information, and it's a lot about thinking about how each of these things relate to your kind of specific subject. But just know that there is a lot of help and support for you. Look at the academic achievement team, the Learning Skills Hub, and we will be able to help. This is just an overview, but we can give you some one-to-one support if you can come to the drop-ins. If you'd like to leave further feedback on the dissertation, please follow this link. And also there's a follow-up webinar on finishing your dissertation on the 1st of April, which you can register for through the Learning Skills Hub. Finally, if anyone has any questions, you can put a few in the chat box and we'll try to answer them. But I'd like to thank you all very much for attending and for joining in. Your projects all sound really interesting, and we look forward to meeting you at one of our drop-ins or our workshops. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.